So welcome everyone to the virtual NHFPL, or Public Humanities at Yale program, Democracy in America. My name is Luis Chavez-Permel, and I am the Deputy Director of the New Haven Free Public Library. I'm really excited and honored that you're all here to welcome this wonderful conversation about the future of the university. And please always remember that your free public library serves as the people's university. So I'll pass it along to our great colleague, Matthew Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Luis. First of all, thanks as ever to our partners in the New Haven Free Public Library, in addition to Luis, especially Rory Martirana, Marian Huggins, Seth Godfrey, and Isaac Shub. This is a partnership, the Public Library and the Public Humanities at Yale. It's been a really important partnership for us, and we are eager to get back in the building sometime soon, but until then, we do what we can. Thanks also to my colleague Karen Rothman, who's worked so hard for this series, and also Swagoto Chakravorty, our Public Humanities Fellow, who is working even now as we speak on the technical end of the webinar. One program note before we get started. Tuesday, April 27th at 7 o'clock is our 15th and final event of the season. We will feature Khalil Johnson from Wesleyan University. He'll be speaking on American education and domestic imperialism. It's a talk on education and its consequences for colonized and dispossessed peoples, based in part on his forthcoming book, Schooled: The Education of Black and Indigenous People in the United States and Abroad, 1730 to 1980. So please join us for that. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Christopher Newfield. Chris took his PhD in English at Cornell, and he taught for many years at UC Santa Barbara before being appointed as research director at the Independent Social Research Foundation in London in 2020. His first book, The Emerson Effect: Individualism and Submission in America, is a study in political psychology, analyzing the interplay between authoritarian and liberal impulses in Ralph Waldo Emerson's thought, articulating what Newfield calls the submissive individualism that is essential to Emersonian self-reliance. It's a study that led Newfield into some of the intellectual territories he's inhabited ever since: market despotism, corporate individualism, liberal racism, and problems of management, or maybe the problem with management. In the years since, Newfield has emerged as one of our most trenchant historians, analysts, and critics of the modern university. His work in this realm includes Ivy and Industry, Business and the Making of the American University, Unmaking the Public University, the 40-year Assault on the Middle Class, and The Great Mistake: How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them. He's a contributor to several other volumes, including A New Deal for the Humanities and the wonderfully titled Mutant Neoliberalism. In recent years, he's also been a prolific activist scholar on the blog Remaking the University. So welcome back to the US, Chris, if only virtually, and it's great to see you. Welcome.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really glad to be here. I have very fond memories of a conversation we had at American Studies Association convention. I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago, that I thought would be, immediately followed up by a continuation, and that has never happened. So I'm glad we have this chance to talk again today. And I'm really sorry that I'm honoring my fond memory of our last conversation by starting this one with a 20-minute lecture. But just compress some stuff, and it may give us some food for things to carry on with. My starting point, my frame right now is a feeling that we've gotten really used to one-way neoliberalism, where regardless of party, we just keep getting more of its familiar features. We get more public budget austerity, marketization, privatization, selective cross subsidies that are focused almost entirely on business and technology. We get more precarization of professional labor. We get structural racism in sort of ever-changing forms, if not very much in the way of change of the substructure. My sense is that in the reality, this is no longer the case, that it's all going in one direction. Neoliberalism is breaking down or already has broken down in places like Hungary and Turkey, where it's being replaced by an authoritarian form of national capitalism. Something like this was happening in the US under Trump, and there's still lots of forces pushing in that direction. And then on the other side, the apparently sort of submissive neoliberal Democrat Joe Biden has, at least in some areas, started to break with this neoliberal paradigm. And so I'm thinking in part about his American Jobs Plan, which I think should inspire more left-wing enthusiasm than it has so far. It's the 12,000-word fact sheet declares, in effect, 4 decades of conservative economics to have been a failure for national life. It casts Reaganomics as a mode of underdevelopment applied to the country's own working people and to its populations of color, resulting in a weakened society unable to rely on its decrepit public systems when it most needs them, as during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. In its rhetoric, at least, Biden's AJP aims not only to avoid the mistakes of Obama, Geithner, and Summers, but also of Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson. It is not colorblind, but race conscious, and promises to distribute resources in a way that explicitly addresses racial disparities. For example, of the $40 billion that Biden requests for upgraded research infrastructure, half is to go to historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, and other minority serving institutions. So the US Senate is, of course, focused on wrecking this plan, and it will succeed, at least in the short run. But the framework is out there, or in other words, that the owl of Minerva has flown in daylight. And I think we should take advantage of this. I mean, my sense is it's a very big reformist package, and it's an opportunity for the world of higher ed to supplement our still very necessary critiques of the neoliberal, the racist, and the settler colonial university with plans for radically reconstructing it. And I'm going to talk now about several modes in which this is going forward at the moment. These conflicted and fluid situations that we're in right now could push universities down some paths that I'm going to show you a graphic for. Can you see that top slide? Okay. It basically looked like this. There we go. These are meant to represent, I don't know, strains or lineages in university thinking, university studies today. And so they're as much modes of study of the future as they are actual predictions of what the future is going to look like. I mean, they're all going to obviously emerge through movements and dialogue and conflict. The first one that I'm going to spend the most time on, I'm going to talk about the other ones more briefly, is basically fragmented decline. This is the business as usual track. It's generated by moving in these directions, basically towards post-democracy, intensified by platform capitalism, with Amazon as a good model. And I'll talk a bit more about that term in a few minutes. And it's very much focused on, at best, private-public partnerships or halfway privatization, and at worst, the colonization of public services or systems by private interests. So anyway, we know quite a bit about this, and it was much of the work that I've been doing in the last many years has been trying to convince people that this particular track, especially folks that are inside the university, is not actually sort of either a slow decline or a gateway towards something better if we just see kind of working on it, but is a total disaster and should be completely chucked. Okay, so what happens here is that inequality, it will increase on this pathway until we complete a segmentation process within the system that is already quite advanced. The high tuition financial aid model continues in this future as it is. Student debt continues to rise, though more slowly. Institutional debt also rises. Public funding remains stagnant and ripe for cuts at the first whiff of a fiscal downturn. In this system, wealthy super premium private universities continue to do extremely well, with their global brands resting on endowment wealth that has benefited from 40 years of financial asset price inflation as a systematic bipartisan government policy, sometimes called the Greenspan put. There are about 16 of these universities. Throw in elite liberal arts colleges and a few others, and you have a group that educates at most about 5% of the total of college students. A second group of colleges that are selective to some degree, maybe 400 in total, will in this future tread water and keep their heads above it depending on regional population and other factors. Mostly they can attract students and manage their costs of attendance only by reducing their own net operating funds. And then there's a third group of open access colleges that educates everybody else. The number of these is about 3,800. They will be funded as job training centers, Joe Biden style, or left to struggle, consolidate, or close. A key issue is that these three groups of universities produce very different levels of learning, not because of any difference in effort or ability on the part of the people who are teaching in them, but because of their political economies and the way that they're structured. So group one offers customized programs with lots of individual feedback. Group three is almost 100% adjunct instruction with too many students to do anything but offer generic and increasingly automated feedback. A kind of a nice visualization of this came from David Lawrence, the former data guru at the Modern Languages Association, who tracked or created an image of basically where in the universe of universities tenure density really starts to pick up. And what it looks like is this. Basically, you get about 2,200 institutions into the universe of higher education before you find a single tenured faculty member. The image that most of us have who went to sort of research one universities and operated in that world of at least 2/3 of the faculty having tenure, being on tenure track, and perhaps more than that, doesn't start until you get here to about basically within at most 200 and more like 150 out of 4,300 universities. So you can see that it's a very elite and exclusive thing to have at least 2/3 of your faculty having tenure. And this affects the way that knowledge is being distributed to a highly unequal population. Group two, I guess, is the other thing that I want to say about this is somewhat closer to group three than you might think. For example, at UC Santa Barbara, only about 2% of graduating English majors write a senior thesis, meaning that a tiny percentage of our graduates year in and year out are competitive in their academic skills with students from places like Princeton or Reed College, where senior theses are required. So to summarize really roughly, gross resource inequality leads to inequality of student learning. So in this status quo future, I'm calling fragmented decline, we have premium learning at the top, limited learning in various gradations for everybody else, especially for the 50% of college starters who leave college without actually getting a degree. Okay, so higher education enforces fragmentation with a specific kind of political economy, one that is devoted to racialized resource inequality. In a landmark study called Separate and Unequal, Anthony Carnevale and Jeff Stoll found that after 1995, most newly enrolled Black and Latinx students attended open access institutions, while white students went to selective colleges, which have much higher graduation rates. Crucially, the study, and it's almost alone in this, at least in the sort of the normative higher education studies world, the most selective, they found that the enormous differences in instructional expenditures per student. So to quote them, the 82 most selective colleges spend almost 5 times as much as the most selective 468 colleges, spend twice as much on instruction per student as happens in the open access schools. These are actually older data. So the trend of the past 15 to 20 years is to extend resource scarcity into universities that previously had been spared this kind of austerity. This is the story of the University of California since around 2000, where a pretty nasty racial correlation is pretty unmistakable. So this slide just shows what happens to state funding as measured as a share of state personal income, how much money people actually have in their pockets, as the share of whites in the undergraduate student population declines. And what you get over the course of the 21st century is a really pretty creepy one-to-one correspondence, with the exception of the financial crisis in the middle, where funding actually dropped faster. So, I mean, obviously this is a textbook definition of structural racism. Causality is complicated, but the issue here is this, that UC resembles nearly all universities in its dedication to access, diversity, and inclusion. It's since the murder of George Floyd, increasingly comfortable denouncing anti-Blackness and explicitly opposing structural racism. And yet it is funding itself, and the state is funding itself, a supermajority Democratic state with a very strong Latinx component of the Democratic Party is doing that. So it clearly, the political economy of the institution conflicts with higher education's stated goal of creating a racially inclusive form of capitalism based on knowledge, innovation, and self-development, rather than on exploitation, violence, segregation, and war. Okay, so my claim here is that the contradiction is functional and can be explained as a way of softening the future that is actually sought today and yesterday and tomorrow by mainstream American political economy, which is, in a phrase, accumulation through inequality. Okay, this was named in the 90s or the early 2000s by some banking consultants as plutonomy, which is not a terrible neologism for it. And basically what it means is a smaller share of returns to labor and a larger share to capital. This theme was made famous by Thomas Piketty's work it came out in 2014, Capitalism in the 21st Century, in which he argues capitalism is returning to its historic norm of growing returns to asset ownership faster than it grows the economy or grows the wages that are tied to that economy, or he might add grows tax returns, which aren't tied to wages. So, I mean, a nice visualization of this aspect of our status quo future is the Michel wedge, named after the economist that first started, promulgating it, where the dark blue line is productivity growth, the light blue line is wages. The current US economy post-1979 has been built on that gap, on wages growing quite a bit more slowly than does productivity, which means that more returns accrue to capital. This is a picture of an intensified accumulation process, and it's supported by governments that function as an accumulation state. So the first period here on the left reflects a different situation, an unusual social bargain between capital and labor. As workers become more productive in that period, they were paid more money. Human capital theory came along to explain that they became more productive by becoming more educated. The motto was learning equals earning. But even if you didn't learn that much, union membership, racial exclusion, and some other things pushed wages up along with productivity for a mostly white male workforce. This ended in the 1970s for blue-collar industrial workers during the deindustrialization of what became the Rust Belt. And this is a fairly familiar story, right? I mean, union busting is a big part of that story, as is race-based segmentation that allows for the super exploitation of some categories of workers in the home care economy, where immigrant women are super exploited, as one example. But these methods of wage control are a little bit trickier with college graduates. College graduates expect a wage premium over high school grads. And the business model for universities, which is based on debt, presumes a wage premium that will allow students to pay back their loans. So the solution that supports intensified capital accumulation is the thing that I mentioned at the start, which is to segment college graduates roughly into the three groups that I mentioned before. So graduates of top colleges have a good chance of entering elite professional services, consulting, corporate law, banking, and finance, and so on. The half of college starters who don't finish can do a lot of white collar work, but always from a position of employment precarity that allows for their wages to stay more or less suppressed. The large group who graduate from a wide range of good, but not globally branded and always now underfunded public and private colleges, which expects to enter a multiracial middle class, such as it still is, gets limited learning, which endows them with mid-level skills, which then entitles them to do professional work under the same kinds of precarious conditions that non-completers are also subject to. So in this fragmented and stratified condition where it has at least three types of institutions, broadly speaking, and it's producing these three crudely put levels of learning, the university system creates a kind of a cognitariat by Uberizing knowledge work. And the university itself has pioneered economic precarity for professionals in the form of the contingent faculty system, who now form the majority of college instructors. It creates high-skilled people and then links those high skills to low or at best medium and generally precarious wages. So think about journalism, which is a classic humanities output into the professional world. So we talk quite a bit now about the gig economy. A key origin of the gig economy is the gig academy. A highly contingent professoriate displays another important feature captured in Colin Crouch's term post-democracy. Crouch defined democracy, the sort of mid-century type, as the struggle for social rights that depended in large part on collective deliberation and the agency that flowed from that, so mass parties, mass communications, local communications, et cetera. Post-democracy replaces deliberation and replaces collective decision-making with marketing and communications controlled by experts who also retain decision rights and are unaffected by the preferences or the demands of constituents. So in the UK, they're called SPADs, right? Special advisors that are in enormous trouble right now if you've been following the news, thanks to David Cameron and his lobbying and Goldsill, et cetera. Post-democracy is also a pretty good description of faculty governance in which administrators offer a purely procedural kind of consultation, shorn of power sharing, joint decision-making, or even the basic sharing of information. On its current path then, the future of the university is to do these two things, is to spread the example of precarity for professional labor under post-democracy. Okay, so enough of that. That's our default one. And the work that I said before, the work that I've done in this mashup field known as critical university studies has aimed to show that the current system isn't actually muddling through towards a bit more social mobility, et cetera, and maybe some social justice if it seems affordable, but leads instead to these things, to precarity, to post-democracy, and to professional decline at the very moment in which the professional classes are kind of on the threshold of becoming meaningfully racially integrated. Okay, so let's take a look at these other ones. Number two, the second possible future is debt-free college. Here, the Sanders-Warren tendency builds on Biden's opening to develop college for all into a new deal for higher education, just to name a pair of projects within this tendency, both of which are still very much alive and growing. So this would generate debt-free university for all students. This can only happen as a practical matter through tuition-free university. The tax system would need a major adjustment to make this work, which will mean continuing major political effort. I'm totally in favor of this. I'm a real free college person. I've costed it out. It's totally affordable. But there's something else to be borne in mind about this particular option. Free college, while keeping student costs low, would retain the current inequality of university resources and inequality, as already noted, that is profoundly racialized. So in the second future, college would be cheaper, but also at least as unjust as it is today. And since lower tuition would, without major intervention that nobody in the Democratic Party is really talking about, since it also lowers revenues by taking away tuition revenues, the debt-free future is educationally more mediocre. Okay, the third possible future is funding unequalized, basically socialist. And in this future, various social movements use the Biden opening to push college for all way past where it's headed at the moment towards the overcoming of structural racism and class inequalities in educational resources. So this would involve basically a new political economy for the country. It would distribute resources to achieve equality of economic inputs across different student populations and invert those inputs according to need. So the most disadvantaged students in terms of their past learning would get the most resources rather than the least, which is the case today. The explicit goal is equality of educational outcomes, not of opportunity. It would use the tax system to redress injustices of income distribution, injustices that reflect the historical interaction of settler, colonial, imperial, and neoliberal forms of accumulation. So this future uses the tax system for more than one kind of educational reparations. It would define educational needs and budget them publicly accordingly, rather than using today's reverse practice of establishing budget scarcity and then allotting the education that that scarcity allows. Okay, and then last, the fourth possible future is abolitionist and aims to dismantle the current university in order to replace it with fully non-capitalist and decolonized processes of higher learning. Ideas about how this system would look would emerge in the process of their construction. These processes would be inspired by varying combinations of decolonial and anti-racist thought, including their critiques of the epistemologies of the global North. This fourth future rests on criticism of public good theories of the social effects of higher education, as, among other things, being grounded in the land grant, or now land grab, of colonial appropriation. The critique of neoliberalism has shown various abuses of the commons that the public good envelope has allowed to go forward. In his new book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, Devarian Baldwin shows how public colleges have used their nonprofit status to support private developer control of the city. Given its concern about public funding as a crossroads of colonial and expropriative forces, this fourth future is unlikely to make claims on the resources of national or state tax systems, which is why I put it over here more on the private side of that axis, which is something to discuss. It may consist of local initiatives that reflect situated epistemologies and entangled identities. These might privilege self-organization in quasi-permanent autonomous zones. These activities are likely to take place in civil society and would be private in that sense, although collectively and communally organized. And they would have many models to draw on for organization, including cooperatives, collectives, freedom schools, storefront colleges, bootleg universities, and social movement services. So that's what it looks like. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up by saying a couple of quick things about this. The first is, I tend to put these last three futures together as all desirable and as all needing to kind of work together and support each other, even though their underpinnings are different. And they're opposed to each other in meaningful ways that cannot be swept under the rug. In particular, I think futures 3 and 4 shouldn't be put in conflict with each other. And I guess I would say the same thing about 3 and 2. I mean, debt-free seems like a halfway measure, but it's a huge massive reform, kind of quasi-revolutionary under finance capitalism, even though it's like, it's like a half step. So I mean, I see it as a half step that would be a major political upheaval whose achievement could lead to lots of other things. Okay, so I'm gonna, in the spirit of seeing these other three futures as kind of polarized together and just set up a kind of overly dramatic binary between 2, 3, and 4 on the one side and the one that we have now. I'm just going to show you a slide of things of features that these point towards. And there are also features that I think are the way that universities ought to be. So it's equality of outcomes across race, socioeconomic status, and institutional types. It's BA degrees that are debt-free. I mean, this is just such a no-brainer that it's amazing to me that we're bogged down in this long war position for it. Deep learning, universities are really about non-monetary, non-job benefits. They're about cognitive gain in the crude sort of cognitive psych sense, but about formation individually and collectively in all sorts of ways that everybody involved in it knows about, and which are not sufficiently in the public discourse, but which everyone I've ever talked to about is interested in, regardless of their background or their political position. And that includes the conservatives that have me on their shows. My book first came out to try to bait me into saying something that they could, do a video clip of. Self-directed research, blue sky research, not driven by financial outcomes, by those objectives, independent of the state, the church, the military, the standard authorities in the business world. Just employment, universities could be a model for basically tenure for all, which is just cause termination. And then finally, I think in some ways, this is the biggest obstacle to making these other futures realer than they seem like they can be right now, is the democratization of small and large group relations within universities. So I mean, democratizing departments, which is a challenge in itself, and doing the same for university governance. This might require the abolition of boards of trustees. It might mean some other kind of collaborative nexus of a kind that we haven't yet imagined. So I guess these futures may seem impossible. Some elements I know are absolutely downright undesirable for some folks. One thing that I can assure you of, based on my research, is that they are all in fact affordable. So I guess the question that I'd leave us with, and that maybe Matt will want to take up, is why don't we build the futures that will get these things? Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That is a lot to think about. I know some of the names on the line here. We have some great educators. We have some of our great grad students. We have a couple of faculty senators and many other people who I don't know. I want to invite you to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can. But I want to start us off with a couple of questions of my own. First of all, I mean, one of the things that your work has caused me to recognize is that I was born in 1958, and as I look at the higher education landscape of my lifetime, I tend to think that there's kind of what was normal and good, and then there's like a departure from the norms. And what I'm starting to realize is that what I think of as normal was really just a blip in the screen of about the first 15 or maybe 20 years after World War II, and that actually most of my lifetime is coeval with what I think of as the breaking of norms. So can you talk a little bit about the assault on the university that going way back? I mean, it was really, Mario Savio wasn't too far off the steps of Sproul Hall giving his free speech before Governor Reagan was assaulting the UC system. So can you just give us kind of the overview of the long history of the assault on the university that has brought us to this place?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the really this really short version. I think it was a realization that elements that had seemed to be fringe radicalisms were being transformed by higher education into majority positions. So kind of anti-capitalism, which is what Lewis Powell was worried about when he wrote that memo that helped, set up the current right-wing think tank system. And the anti-war movement, which was meddling very much not only in the foreign policy of that period, but in really the long legacy of settler colonial turned imperial histories of just violence as the normal way of expanding and settling conflicts. Greg Grandin's really good book about this. It totally sort of retells the story of American democracy as that. That particular tradition was being challenged, and not again by small numbers, by large numbers. And then I think the really pivotal one was Black civil rights, where it looked like you could start to imagine coalitions forming. Think about Martin Luther King was the middle class churchiness of it meant a possible popularity that was not as much the case with even Malcolm, say nothing of Black power, which they felt like they could marginalize in that period. So I think that's the simple explanation of how the ball really got rolling. And then by the time that you and I are, getting out of graduate school and starting to look for jobs, the culture wars are beginning as a kind of the continuation of that. And then the budget squeeze is not a separate story. It's just a story that's integrated very much with putting universities and their potential social powers, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, back in their place, anti-feminist, or sort of pro-feminist, anti-patriarchy.
Along with that, I think one of your graphs seemed to me to, it's the one you showed it was the decline in education funding and the relative decline in the number or the percentage of white students in colleges. I think that was the slide.
Yeah.
Seems to me to be related, and I don't know if you know this book, but Heather McGhee's new book, The Sum of Us, which talks about the costs, the social costs to everyone of racism, and her great metaphor is the draining of the public pool. Like the minute the courts ruled that public spaces like municipal pools had to be integrated, white people decided they would rather drain the pool, and so no one could swim, rather than to actually enforce integration. To what extent is that the kind of story of higher education in the last two generations?
Yeah, that is the story. And there's the public pool, there's also the public school. And so that gets, people start private schools as a way of basically resegregating or never actually having to do integration on the scale that seemed to be mandated by court decisions and legislatures. So, I think it's very much the same story. The difference is that, I don't know if there's a difference. The middle class, including the white middle classes, it's a large lumpy thing, was increasingly split about how to respond to this. And so it was, the danger was that there were going to be people that were going to fight to reopen the pool, the public pool, rather than just building a private one in their backyard. And so the struggle over higher education, I think, has been very dialectical in that way. Enormous legacy of student protest that never went away. A lot of folks associate that with the 60s, but it's just been continuous. And in California and other places, the new turn of sort of neoliberal austerity re-prompted it again in after the financial crisis, putting graduate student cost of living issues, policing issues on the agenda in a way that, again, is bringing these issues together in a kind of potential coalitional front. So I think we're moving forward as well as backwards, and it feels like this has been happening for a while now.
Right. So one of the questions are starting to come in, which is great, and I invite more, and I will start turning to them in just a second. You know, one of the great challenges that we have, and you pointed to this as well, is, you know, the hallmark of the neoliberal university is that we are all putting out our own local fires at every minute, and it's very hard to come together in any kind of way. So we're dealing with these huge problems at the level of the department often, or at best at the level of our own university. But these are systemic, national, even global problems, and there's very little coming together. So I guess, you know, you talked about faculty governance, you talked about the Democratic Party, you talked about policy. You know, what do you see as the most hopeful kind of intervention on these issues where we're already so atomized and divided and busy?
I would like to see tenured faculty in different institutions work together nationally. I would like to see tenured faculty work with groups like the New Faculty Majority, which is a contingent faculty organization. Local alliances between faculty and graduate students, which were really starting to happen in response to the brutal police crackdown on the COLA strike at UC Santa Cruz before COVID came along. There was actually quite a lot of solidarity that can be ramped up. And I think the fourth piece of this is getting the national policy picture into the mix in the same way that people have been talking about in the wake of the failed Amazon unionization movement in Alabama. Unionization, you know, but which I think is going to start with grad students, it's going to continue to spread with faculty. And so local movements in conjunction with a more positive national environment, I think is going to make a big difference in the next few years.
Here's the first question. In Cornell West's tenure conflict with Harvard, he said, quote, "Tenure is the difference between first class and second class citizenship. Can you discuss tenure and power?"
Tenure equalizes in the way that union membership should do, in theory, the power relation between the employee and the employer, between the administration and the faculty member. So it eliminates the at-will firing of controversial figures, which Cornell West certainly is in, you know, in the circles that could potentially affect his career there. So it's I mean, it's seen as this kind of, you know, it's cast as job for life as a privilege, and I mean, it is. That's not the only thing that it is. It's also something that should be deprivileged by being distributed into the workplace, including the academic workplace, such that you can't basically end the conversation or decide the outcome of a conversation by firing somebody or by threatening to fire them. So it's, you know, the AAUP argument has always been that tenure is one of the pillars of academic freedom. And I would just modify that to say equity, power equity that protects employment is the pillar of job security, or sorry, of academic freedom, and we just happen to call it tenure. As I said earlier, I mean, I would like tenure for all in the teaching and instructional staff, but I think that also has to happen to the staff who are now increasingly a majority of the employees of universities, who know tons of things and who would be much more willing to work with us if they had something like the protections that tenured faculty have, and they don't have that.
Right, right. And which gets to another point that you kind of gestured towards when you mentioned Devery and Baldwin's work in The Shadow of the Ivory Tower. Those staff people are also townspeople in most cases. And so our standard frame of town and gown is actually a misperception in the sense that much of town is actually also in gown in part. And it seems like we're faced as faculty with fighting a war on two fronts, really, which is very complicated. One is that we're fighting to try to defend what we see as you know, the best the most idealistic kind of version of higher education, which is what most of us thought we were signing up for in the first place. There's that fight against, the many forces that you've identified. But the other fight is that universities are often, if not always, I'll just say often, really bad actors on the local scene. And so we're fighting, for some kind of justice for the town from within the university. And that's a difficult fight on its own, but it's especially difficult if we're also trying to defend higher education at the same time. Can you just talk a little bit about how you understand the politics of this, and maybe in your research you've come across some kind of best practices for fighting these fights?
Well, yeah, I think tenured faculty are again a key actor here, because most have been persuaded by administrative arguments that these enterprises are necessary for the financial survival of the institution. So there's a comment. It varies, right? So some institutions, like Cornell, for example, it wasn't a lack of money; it was more, entitlement and in relation to the local community that drove a lot of the negative reactions that it had. And it's much better now, I think, than it was when I was there in the late 80s. In the public sector, the kind of institutions that Baldwin is writing about in his book, it's desperation justifying kind of anything, right? So it's like, we're poor too, and we don't have any choice. We have to generate multiple revenue streams, right? The state has required this of us. So real estate development is one of those. And what we do is we launder it into education for students of color, immigrants, first gen, et cetera. But we have to do that just as a mode of survival. And I think the main way that I've known how to deal with this is just by doing the financial analysis and say, well, look, budgets are also a question of justice. If you're going to be a just university, if you believe in social justice, you also need to believe in budget justice. And that involves creating a solidarity urban fabric and ecosystem in which the environment and the people that you're bringing into as employees as well as students have a chance to thrive in the way that you want your own people to thrive. There are ethical arguments, there are militant political actions and pressures, and then there are the political economy work that I've mostly focused on, that I think shows that this kind of abusive practice is not financially necessary. Mm-hmm. We just all have to climb back together away from it and do something better.
Mm-hmm. At various points, and again, feel free to submit your questions. At various points in your talk, you seem to be pointing to faculty governance as a key to it all, really, at least a starting point. I was intrigued by your fleeting mention of abolishing the board of trustees. There's an idea. But in any case, it seems like honest, good, open, transparent, democratic faculty governance has to be the starting point for many of the kinds of changes and many of the kinds of organizing that you're talking about. I'm on the faculty senate here. There are a couple of senators on the line I see. We've had some small victories. They've been significant. We've only existed for 6 years. We've made, I think, some real changes to the university, but our victories do tend to be small ones. And so I'm just curious if in your travels, do you have any, I guess, models of real kind of meaningful formations that have taken shape within a university that have really changed the tenor of the way the institution functions? Are there anecdotes? Are there best practices? Anything you can offer along the lines of reforming what is really, and it doesn't matter if you're at Yale or Berkeley or Swarthmore, faculty governance is a global problem, the way the profession is configured right now. Do you have any advice for your colleagues on that front?
The best stories I've heard recently come from unionized senates. So Western Washington was an example where they got bargaining leverage, which then produced mutuality and respect. And that just seems like the first step towards, having proper, it's not exactly democracy, but at least having sort of a decent conversation, right? And the sharing of information and so on. I think the inequality of power is just creates corruption. And we faculty, and I include myself in this, are a part of a kind of a corrupt bargain, to the extent that we can usually get better individual deals privately through back channel individual work with individual administrators, matches for grants that we get in the case that for me, by not going after those people publicly, who the next day we're going to ask for, a grant match. So that, I think, we have to talk about setting up a situation in which that particular channel is controlled by active public exchanges that allow for criticism that doesn't make even people with tenure feel like they're jeopardizing their careers at that particular institution by speaking out. I mean, the chilling effect of the current situation is terrible, and it's, as you just said, Matt, it's happening all over the place. And I think the inequality of other kinds of power, in addition to job security, is something that really, at least the threat of unionization, is what would overcome it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not optimistic that there's going to be much change in the tenured professoriate without pressure coming from untenured faculty and our own graduate students, like meaningful, oppositional, angry, critique that will then move us in more in this direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In addition, we do have many grad students on the line, I can see. So in addition to what you've already outlined in terms of the kind of organizing that's required in this moment, as we close out the hour, can you just kind of in the spirit of mentorship, can you talk a little bit about, there are many different ways to inhabit a university, and I think that it's something maybe we don't talk to our grad students enough about, is there are ways to kind of wear the institution like a loose garment and still kind of find your own way of being who you are, and doing the research that's important to you, and do the teaching that is ethical and sensible and suits your kind of philosophical outlook, even if you're embedded in this really problematic institution. And I think that that's something for younger scholars, it's a hard thing to get your head around. I know it was for me when I was first starting out. Can you just reflect a little bit on your own philosophical outlook about how to do good work from within a bad institution?
I think it's modeling collaboration with each other. I mean, we model neoliberal subjectivity really well with grad students, right? In other words, competitiveness, the quest to, dominate discursive spaces with preparation and other things, are not as good at just at cooperating with each other, even within departments, doing collaborative research programs, for example, with students, just local, unfunded stuff. And I think that's quite important. That's really where I would start it, is just how do department members treat each other at that level. Second thing is bringing grad students in on local departmental decision-making, which includes the sharing of information about governance, about budgets, A third thing is just like listening. Maybe that's the first thing. You know, like what's happening? Yeah, it's just like, because we don't, you know, like we're really great at doing what I'm doing right now.
Well, that's what we're trained to do. So just again, to remind folks, Chris Newfield's books on education include Ivy and Industry, Business, and the Making of the American University, 1880 to 1980. Unmaking the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class, and The Great Mistake, how we wrecked public universities and how we can fix them. In this last minute or two, where are you headed next in your researches, especially now that you're out of the academy and you're in that research foundation?
Yeah, it's more post-capitalist economy for higher ed, but putting it in the social context, and not only, you know, looking at in sort of internal relations with the university itself. I don't have to only write about the University of California, for example. And there's like plenty of terrible things happening in higher ed in the UK to keep me quite busy.
Yes, that's it is. I mean, that's the thing. These are global problems, and it's hard to think about them in those terms when you're embroiled in the daily, putting out of fires in your own university.
Yeah, I mean, I have an ongoing project that I'm doing with a couple of people here and some folks in the US called, Global Higher Education in 2050. And it's trying to completely internationalize this conversation, move away from the Anglo-American model that is really actually not as influential in most parts of the world as it was even 10 years ago. And so I'd like to invite anybody who's interested in that to get in touch with me, because it's the more the merrier. I mean, we're really trying to create a kind of a multi-sided research team on more or less every continent. And so I welcome people to write to me, and either with questions about this or about futures work as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's great to talk to you as always, and thank you for your work. I mean, these are really pressing issues for so many of us, and also for so many of us, we don't really have the time to think about them. So it's been great to have this minute to just breathe and think alongside you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming, and we hope to see you on April 27th. Khalil Johnson speaking about education and domestic imperialism. So thanks. Everyone, take care of yourselves. Don't let your guard down. Wash your hands. Wear a mask. Get your vaccination. Don't touch your face. Take care of yourself. And God save us. All right. Thank you.
See you later, Matt.